3 decades ago, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers captured my imagination. Like many of my fellow 90s kids, I watched after school, joined the official fan club, and of course, collected the toys. Eventually, I put those toys away, but the flame of my Power Rangers fandom never died. Now, in this milestone 30th anniversary year, I am re-examining the show, its legacy, and the tale of its most legendary ranger across media. It's time to get back to action. Welcome to Summoning the Zords, a Power Rangers fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the comic book story Shattered Grid is one of the original Master Morphers himself, Chris DeLanda. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. 'Tis the morphing hour.
Yes, I'm excited to have you here. As the audience knows, we covered the first 2 years worth of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers series from Boom Studios earlier on in our podcast run. And I always intended to come back to the comics. I wasn't quite sure how far I would get, but at a minimum, I knew we had to talk about Shattered Grid because it was huge. And so I'm excited to have you here to finally be able to talk about that. But even just beyond that, just to talk about your history as a Power Rangers fan, your fandom, how you got into it. So maybe we could start there. I mean, you've been on my other show, My Comic Shop History. We did a couple of episodes on the original Mighty Morphin movie and then the 27 reboot movie years ago. We've since recovered them on this podcast. But you and I have talked Power Rangers before, but again, this is your first time here. So what is your Power Rangers fan journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've covered this a little bit with a lot of your other guests, but my story, at least up until a point, is pretty similar to a lot of that. Like, I think if you're a man of a certain age, which we both are, it was just your obsession in the 90s. And like, I remember the first episode of Power Rangers I saw, it was Food Fight. It was the Pudgy Pig episode. And like, I just remember like just my mind being blown. And this was really before like the mania had caught on. And it was just my whole world for years and years and years. Like, I loved Ninja Turtles growing up too, but I was a little like I came in at the tail end of that a little bit. So Power Rangers really felt like it was my thing for my generation, toys, t-shirts. I was the Red Ranger for Halloween, like 3 years in a row, like that kind of stuff. And then my fandom kind of like diverges a little bit. I was definitely the weird kid on the bus that watched Power Rangers like way too long. Like, there's always that one that I distinctly remember going to school so it's 95, right? When Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie, comes out. And I remember it just being the talk of the school. Everyone was like, did you see this? Did you see that? We were all talking about it. It was the hot goss, so to speak. And then I remember like 2 years later, I went to go see Turbo in the movie theater, and like everyone made fun of me for going to see it. Like I distinctly remember like, wait, we all love this. Why don't we all still love this? So I hung on for a little bit. I watched pretty regularly all the way through Power Rangers in Space, which is like part of there's a meta narrative there, right? Like those all kind of connect a little bit to like Zordon, and they all tie back to the original Mighty Morphin. And then after that, it kind of diverges. So after that, I aged out, so to speak, but I was always kind of like casually aware of the franchise and always had some kind of attachment to it. Like I would check in on it every once in a while. I would like, see an episode while channel flipping of something, that series of whatever, and put it on. And then like every so often, every like 5 to 10 years or so, I would not get really back into it, but get like dip my toe in a little bit. So like, I remember I was in high school at one point. I was laid up in the hospital for like 2 weeks. And there was a marathon on of the new season at that time, which was Dino Thunder, which is the one where Tommy Oliver comes back. And I was like, oh, this is cool. I'm laying in a hospital bed. I'm going to watch a bunch of this. So I watched a bunch of that too. It also helped that I remember the Yellow Ranger on that season being like really, really cute. Like, and just bringing that, I'm sure that's also a meta thread, right? Like we all watched because we loved Kimberly. So like that kind of brought the nostalgia back. And then like just been casually aware off and on. Funnily enough, like while we were all living out our collective trauma during the pandemic, I came across an article on CBR or something, or like the 10 best seasons of Power Rangers or whatever. And I was like, yeah, let me see what's up. And so I read this article, and then I was like, oh, this one actually sounds kind of cool. So then I actually watched a full season of Power Rangers during the pandemic. I watched Power Rangers RPM, which was like a very nice escapism from the troubles of the world. So that was kind of fun too. And actually RPM ends up factoring pretty big into Shattered Grid, which we're going to talk about. So, and then I guess also like, because I work for comic conventions, like I'm also, that's part of my job too, is just kind of like at limited touch points with that franchise, because Power Rangers fans, like, I feel like Power Rangers fans fall into two camps, right? You've got us, who were like big 90s Mighty Morphin fans, fell off with it, lapsed fans, what have you. And then you've got the people who stayed, and it's like their whole entire reason for being. And like, that's cool, man. Like, it's a niche thing. Like, I'm not taking that away from anybody, but like the Power Rangers, the hardcore fans are hardcore about it, and they will let you know. So like, there's always Rangers floating around the convention circuit that I've got to keep my eye on and stuff too.
Gotcha. I will say, my experience as well, it is a very robust fandom, and I say that because our numbers for this podcast, they're not through the roof, but they're solid, especially given the fact that I have not, I suppose, marketed this maybe as aggressively as I have my Superman podcast, for example. Which is the primary pod. Not that this doesn't, I care very much about this, but that's the weekly show, and that's the one that is sort of the flagship show of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network. Yet we still get a good amount of traction. I just like, there are a lot of fans out there, and I don't know. I feel like the ones who are listening to this show maybe fall into the more lapsed casual camp, maybe. I don't know, but I'm sure there's a mix, and regardless of which category people fall into, the more casual fans or the real hardcore ones who never stopped watching the show, boy, I appreciate everybody. But no, but like, as you're saying that, it's yeah, I mean, the fact that we found an audience, again, even with sort of minimal efforts in terms of getting the word out there, really speaks to that.
I think your Superman promotion is just personal bias at Hissy Says wearing a Death of Superman t-shirt. Oh, sorry, Reign of the Supermen.
Yes. No, but it's again, Power Rangers is near and dear to me as well, and this has been an absolute joy doing this, and I love hearing you lay out your history with it. I mean, I remember again when we did those couple of episodes on the '95 movie and the 2017 reboot on My Comic Shop History podcast. I remember you were kind of educating us about the larger Zordon era, right? That more or less concluded with Power Rangers in space, and because that was past where I and our other guest had watched. So you were able to lend that perspective. And then over the course of doing this podcast and talking to, at least one person, maybe a couple who watched past where I did, it really is fascinating, right? To kind of get that perspective. I mean, that's one of the things I will say, like with Shattered Grid, I feel like and we'll get into it, of course, but I enjoyed it, but I feel like I didn't get as much mileage out of it as you probably did, or someone who kept watching, because we're pulling in all of these Ranger teams, and I can appreciate it, and I know, oh, they're from this season or that season, but I don't know anything about them, and I don't have any personal attachment.
Yeah, I mean, like I think that Shattered Grid, and like you said, we can get into it, is perfect for that lapsed casual fan, right? Like it's something that is very much a core focus on the Mighty Morphin team, but there's like enough fan service if you know the franchise that it really, really delivers on that front. I do feel like I'm maybe a little bit closer to you in that regard, but I kind of got the sense. I was trying to look at it through fresh eyes. I gave it a reread this week, and I was thinking about those like hardcore Power Rangers fans who are like so obsessed, and they have their shipping pairs, and like they have their favorite characters. And in that regard, it kind of doesn't deliver, because it's just really like a glorified string of cameos for like with a few minor exceptions. But beyond that, I mean, it's just cool. Like I'm such a sucker for time travel stories and like alternate universe stories. And like Shattered Grid is basically like Power Rangers Back to the Future 2, which is like just so right up my alley. It's so perfect. Like, or like Age of Apocalypse, like, which is one of my favorite X-Men comics. Like, this is very much like an alternate universe Power Rangers story, which is really cool.
True, true. Well, so as we're segueing into Shattered Grid, so talk to me about the comics themselves, because as I've said on this podcast many times, I completely missed the boat on these. Heard about how great they were. Again, it's weird. We're doing the Shattered Grid episode. I know we're years late to the game here, but to me, it's brand new. Like, this is really cool. So I completely missed the boat. Right? They were coming out. I heard nothing about how amazing they were, and it's not that I was dismissive of them. I had not been plugged into the franchise in so long, and even at that point in time, my comics reading had really kind of dwindled. So I just wasn't dialed into it. So it's been amazing now. And especially reading the comics hand in hand with rewatching the show and seeing how things fit together and how they're answering these questions that you had or you never even knew you had as you were watching it as a kid. It's amazing. But you were following these along the way, right?
Yes and no. So when I think the Boom series started in 2016, if that sounds right to you. So I was actually working in comics at the time. I was working for Marvel and doing PR and stuff. So the last thing on earth you really want to do when you're forced to read every single Marvel comic that comes out is like go home and read more comics. So while I was working at Marvel, my non-Marvel comics reading really took a nosedive. So I remember like reading maybe the first issue when it came out, and I was like, wow, that was actually pretty good, because like you think about licensed comics and the ceiling tends to be pretty low for those in general. Like, I mean, you go back far enough and you've got your Larry Hama GI Joe stuff, which is like a high watermark, but like by and large, the license is doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. And so I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. And I always made a note, like a mental note, to come back to it, but I didn't for like a couple of years until really actually right around when Shattered Grid was kind of heating up. And I just remember like all of the fervor and speculation around Lord Drakkon and that first appearance. And I was like, that sounds really cool. I really can't wait to get on that. And then like, I remember like the marketing for the event kind of washing over me. And, you work in comics or you follow comics for long enough and everything feels really samey. Like, it's like, oh, another universe ending threat, another yada, yada. And like, especially in the last like 10 years, it's just like been there, seen that, done that. And I distinctly do remember the marketing for Shattered Grid and feeling like, wow, this seems kind of big, and that the word epic gets thrown around maybe a little too much nowadays, but I do remember thinking like, oh, that seems kind of epic, like especially as somebody who was casually aware of the franchise and like was a little bit more invested in the canon of it all, kind of like stitching together of all those different disparate Power Rangers seasons and stuff. Have you ever gotten to, just segueing really quick, have you ever heard of Power Rangers Hexagon?
Oh, yeah. We actually talked about this at the end of our Zeo trilogy, which is not even out yet as of this recording. But was that the proposed season that would have had a civil war between Jason and Tommy?
Yeah, and it was like Hexagon was supposed to be like Shield in the Marvel universe, and like Tommy would have been leading this Shield like unit that would have like all of the united the canon of all of these different Power Rangers teams, right? Like they were all squads folded under this militaristic organization or whatever. And like I remember hearing about that when it was coming out and that it never happened. And I was like, oh, wow, that sounds so cool. And so to me, like something like Shattered Grid really scratched that itch of like seeing this all in one place for the first time. And, you've got your like Forever Red episodes and stuff like that bring it together. But ultimately those are like the show's for kids, right? Like, so it doesn't necessarily scratch that same itch. And the comics to me always, the beauty of these comics really is that like the character development is there on the page in a way that maybe it wasn't in the show, because like it's a show for kids, which is totally fine. But it's clearly aimed at the 30-something market who grew up with this stuff.
Yes. I'll say the same thing about these comics that I said about Once and Always when we talked about that. And I do want to, as much as we did a whole episode on that, I do want to get your take on that recent
Sure.
special. But I'll say the same thing that I did about that, where I feel like, again, these comics, that Once and Always special, I feel like they were made for me, for you, for those of us in that group who grew up with it. And there's something special about that, right? Because I just feel like it ties together so much of the experience that we had. And I'm grateful for these projects that can do that. So, well, on that note, let me ask you about Once and Always. And I think there are a couple of places where, we might have some connection points in terms of what we're talking about.
Sure.
But Once and Always, this recent special, did you enjoy it?
I did. I did. Like I can't say it was good, but in terms of like what it set out to do, I thought it was great. It was a pure celebration of nostalgia, and in that regard, it was awesome. Like I really enjoy this franchise so much, and I'm reminded about that when I read these comics or when I buy one of the many Power Rangers toys you see behind me. But then like sometimes I'll go back and watch the show and it doesn't resonate with me anymore, because even when I go back and watch like the old episodes that we grew up with, because that's not really made for me anymore, and that's totally fine. And I think some people maybe take offense to that but like it's not for me anymore. And like the actual like structure of it of Once and Always was really fun. It was great to see Billy and Zach back. Kind of really wish they would have gotten, played a little hardball with the contracts and maybe got everybody. But like, it was still really good to see everybody back in one place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So this Shattered Grid comic book event that we're talking about here follows Lord Drakkon as he attacks Power Rangers teams of different eras and steals their morphers so he can power his armies, but more importantly, so that he can increase his connection to the Morphin Grid to eventually get to the point where he can enter and reshape reality. And so that's our central premise for this, and it took place over issues 25 through 30 of the Mighty Morphin Power Ranger series written by Kyle Higgins. There's also a free comic book day special and the Shattered Grid #1 one-shot that wrapped everything up. And then there were also 4 issues of Go-Go Power Rangers that told a story that tied into it, but was really its own thing as well. Not to continue to delay our fully diving into Shattered Grid, but in advance of Shattered Grid, I did finally, for the first time, read the first couple of arcs of Go-Go Power Rangers.
Great.
So good.
It's great.
So
it's great.
Good.
That book in particular, like, I feel like they struck a really good balance with it. And I'm not really reading them anymore, but the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers main book for the duration of that run was very much like the bombastic event stuff, certainly leading up to Shattered Grid. And then Go-Go Power Rangers was more like the character stuff. It like, if in the parlance of like X-Men comics, it would be, the main book is where they fight Magneto and the other one is where they like play baseball and stuff. And like that stuff really, really worked for me. And like Ryan Parrott, who did those books, has just a real ear for that dialogue. And I really do think like we need to talk about Dan Mora, who's just absolutely tremendous. And like now, 5 years later, he's one of the biggest working artists in comics. He's like drawing Superman and Batman, and he started doing Power Rangers books, which look incredible. Like they look incredible.
No, I echo that. Well, actually, not to engage in some shameless self-promotion, but very recently on Digging for Kryptonite, we covered Mark Waid and Dan Mora's World's Finest series. We looked at the first year of that. And yeah, his art, there and here, just amazing. And World's Finest in particular, what was so amazing was that, that book has a very Silver Age vibe to it. And he was able to strike this balance in the art where it felt so fresh and modern, yet at the same time felt in keeping with this more Silver Age aesthetic that Mark Waid was going for in the writing. And it's just, it's like, I'm looking at it and I'm not an artist at all in that respect. It's like, I don't know how he did it. Like it just walked this perfect line. So going back and seeing his earlier work on that Go-Go Power Ranger series was great. To be honest, I think I sort of shot myself in the foot because I enjoyed those character-centric, quieter stories so much, and I read them right before Shattered Grid. And I enjoyed Shattered Grid, and I get why it was such a huge hit and all of that. But as I was reading it, it's so big, and you have all these Rangers floating around, and I kind of longed for those more personal stories of Go-Go Power Rangers. But yeah, I mean, they were, and for anyone not familiar, while the Kyle Higgins Mighty Morphin Power Ranger series at the beginning of the Boom era took place right after Tommy had broken free from Rita's spell, over in Go-Go Power Rangers by Ryan Parrott and Dan Mora, we had a look at the Power Rangers before Green with Evil. So we see them very early on in their tenure as Power Rangers. And in those first couple of arcs, there's some great stuff. Trini has a crush on Jason and they're training together, and Billy is interviewing at the Promethea organization and he's considering whether or not he should pass on his powers to Matthew Cook, this previously unknown other student at Angel Grove who Kimberly is in a relationship with and is ultimately abducted and replaced by this putty monster and is meant to infiltrate the team. Zach is questioning Zordon about why Jason and not Zach had been made leader of the team. Like, there's some great stuff. I really, I was so pleased with the Go-Go Power Rangers series. I can't speak highly enough.
Matthew Cook is such a great comic book retcon device, like kind of like how every time there's a new Star Wars whatever, we find out that Darth Vader had like a 57th secret apprentice or whatever. Like it's always so funny when books do that. But yeah, I agree. Like that character stuff for me is what resonates more now. And when you go back and watch like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which I'm sure you are much more recent and current on than I am, like those characters are very broad. And they have to be because it's a show for children and the episodes are wrapped up in 23 minutes, but you've got the geek, the jock, the valley girl, and so actually spending a little bit of time to get to know them and live in that world and their day to day as teenagers is really cool. The thing that really struck me, like with Go-Go Power Rangers and with the Higgins book, is the character development for Tommy gets a lot of character development for sure, but also like Jason, because when you go back and watch that show, Jason's kind of nothing. He's like your generic leader dude. And when I was a kid, and I'm sure you probably feel the same way, Green Ranger all the way. Like Green Ranger was the fan favorite, and he still is for me. Like I still love the Green Ranger, but as I'm getting older, I find a little bit more to like about Jason, and I'm realizing that personally, I think I kind of gravitate toward that reluctant leader archetype. Like, and the books do it so well too, because they gave Tommy and Jason the Wolverine and Cyclops dynamic that they should have had all along, or the Leonardo and Raphael. And like, as I'm growing up, like I loved Wolverine as a kid, but now I'm like, man, Cyclops is the best. Like, so Cyclops is my favorite. And like Jason is the Cyclops of the Power Rangers rather.
That's very much been the experience that I've had in going back, right? Going into this being like, oh, Tommy's the best. And again, I think we all of us feel that to some extent or another, but especially in rewatching it, I agree completely and identify with what you're saying, where I've really gravitated a lot more towards Jason. And very recently we covered Power Rangers Zeo, and it was so fascinating to watch him come back as the Gold Ranger and to see him now in the role of the Sixth Ranger, the Wolverine. And we talked about this. It's like, even in those episodes, like he's just so much cooler and more relaxed without shouldering the burden of being the leader of the Rangers. But it was just so funny. And I'm so grateful that we got, and it's funny because in my head, I always thought that was such a larger part of Zeo. But when you go back, it's so deep into the season. He doesn't do that many episodes. But I was so grateful that we got to see that dynamic flipped, where now Tommy's the leader, this very straight-laced leader, and you get Jason. He's in his black shirt, and he's just like sauntering around, and he still feels like Jason. Don't get me wrong, but it just flipped that, and it was cool to see that.
That's cool. I got to go back and rewatch those too, because I always really loved Zeo. I think like those designs are so cool, and like the Gold Ranger looks so cool. He's got a staff. Like that's cool.
Yeah, no, 100%. So those Go-Go Power Rangers issues were really tremendous. I'm glad I read them. I just wanted to have a little bit of context for that series because I knew there were those few issues that tied into Shattered Grid. But even on that front, I really didn't know going into this what the structure of it was, right? I knew there were Go-Go issues that were part of it, but I didn't know if it was more of a straight crossover or what. And I wasn't sure because, again, the books took place at different points in the timeline, yet we have all of these timeline shenanigans. So I had no idea. And I was pleasantly surprised as I was reading issues 9 through 12 of Go-Go, which are part of Shattered Grid, but just take place at their point in the timeline, and we deal with the Ranger Slayer, the older Kimberly Hart of Lord Drakkon's world, who has been sent to our world to free Lord Drakkon, but she ends up earlier. She arrives earlier than she was supposed to. So she's at the point in time of the Go-Go Power Rangers era where Tommy hasn't yet joined the team, and she faces off against the Rangers, and eventually they're able to break Lord Drakkon's spell over her. And I really enjoyed it. I appreciated the fact that you could really read those as their own arc, which is what I did. I read the main Shattered Grid, and then I read the Go-Go issues, and they read great. And to be honest, in certain respects, I enjoyed them more, I think, than the main than the main Shattered Grid event. I won't lie.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like there, and it really only ties in like right at the very end too. So, like you said, it's not required reading, but it's, you know, like any comic book event, it's in a way like supplemental and additive, but not necessary. And yeah, like that Ranger Slayer character is so cool. Again, like kicking it back to Dan Mora, that design is so striking and arresting. Like even something as simple as changing the white on the costume to black is so elegant in its simplicity, and makes the character look completely different and so cool. And the little design quirk of her bow being the two of the evil Green Ranger swords kind of like end to end, it's just so cool and so striking. And just the way that he remixed the mythology of the character too. I don't know if he designed Drakkon, but we should talk about that too, because that's such an incredibly cool design as well. He might not have, because I think that was in the main book that he debuted, but it's so cool.
Yeah, Drakkon I think Kyle Higgins and we didn't mention yet the artist on the Mighty Morphin issues, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but Daniele de Nicuolo.
That's what I would have gone with. So I was reading that today, and I was like, I'm going to have to pronounce this. So thank you for taking that off my back.
But yeah, I mean, great. I mean, you're between the writing and the art on both books. Really, we were in great hands with this Shattered Grid event. But yeah, the Lord Drakkon design is awesome. It's funny. I think I had seen this at the time, but I didn't have the context for it. So I watched it and I was like, okay, I didn't know what to make of it. But that trailer, that live action trailer with Jason David Frank as Lord Drakkon. So again, I had seen this at the time to promote the comic book event, but again, didn't really know what to make of it. But then I rewatched it now, and especially in light of his passing, it was special to be able to kind of take that in. And my understanding from reading Wikipedia is that I guess there were some talks about doing a live action version of this. Are you aware of this?
No, I mean, I know that he, before he passed, was working on something similar, but not Power Rangers. But I mean, I would love to see it. If so, that would be cool. I guess my like, from what I understand, he was pretty active in like helping to promote this. Which, I mean, he filmed a trailer for it, but like, I remember him talking a lot about it, and he was always on boom panels at conventions and stuff, and he just seemed to really embrace that they were doing something new with the character and something different.
Yeah, I think you can understand why that would be appealing. I mean, even taking the potential financial aspect of it out of the equation, but just factoring in like, hey, they're doing this as an alternate take on this character that he played for so long, and it's definitely a very intriguing, captivating version of Tommy Oliver, this alt universe incarnation who continued to align with Rita until he eventually killed her and took over, right, and dominated that world, and is now looking to encroach upon other worlds as well. So it is kind of fascinating, especially, of course, we're all so familiar with where Tommy Oliver started and how his arc unfolded, and sort of this question of like, well, what if he didn't join the Power Rangers? What would become of him? And so to get a look at that, it is pretty fascinating. So yeah, it was cool that he was as involved as he was, and watching that trailer was pretty neat. I also finally, again, another instance, I'm very late to the game, but I finally watched that quote unquote bootleg fan film.
Yeah, the Adi Shankar thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Not for me.
No.
Not for me.
Yeah, it's I mean, I guess that's kind of it's a separate conversation. But yeah, it was there are aspects of it where I'm like, oh, okay, I do appreciate taking this more adult look, but it went, they really overshot the mark with that. So,
Well, you bring up an interesting point though, because especially as we're talking about these comics, like I think that there is a subset of people who consume superhero fiction, whether it be comics or movies. I think you could probably see this most recently in the Zack Snyder universe. But there are these people who equate dark and gritty with sophisticated, and it's not exactly the same. And so like something doesn't automatically become smarter or more sophisticated if it's more violent and more dark. Like, you Dark Knight Returns is the exception that proves the rule in so many ways. So like these Boom comics are bright, they're poppy, they're colorful, and yet they feel adult in a way. Like there's meat on the bone there that is not like a cheap, like that bootleg thing, that just feels dark and gritty for the sake of being dark and gritty, if that makes any sense.
no, I get what you're saying. I think we do differ I think on our assessment of the
I
Snyder
know
films, but
you love that stuff.
but I do get where you're coming from on that.
How much time you got? We could do that episode right now.
We won't subject the Power Rangers audience to that. They don't want to hear that. But no, it is funny looking at that fan film, looking at these comics, and then most recently looking at Once and Always. Because I think in each of those instances, you do see attempts to tell stories, again, for an older audience who grew up reading it to varying degrees of success. And I think in fairness to that fan film, it came before all the rest of this. Right.
Yeah.
And there's a lot about it that is pretty cool, but yeah, it's again, probably goes a little bit too far, but it's still it was interesting to watch for sure. And I'm glad that I finally did. For anyone who's not familiar, it's just over 10 minutes. And the setup for it is that the planet Earth and the Machine Empire had made this truce. And you kind of get the backstory of how the Power Rangers all fell apart and, fell one by one. And I won't kind of spoil the twist of it, but it was kind of a cool ending to it, I thought.
It's Katie Sackhoff in it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the thing. It's none of the original actors playing the characters. So it's Katie Sackhoff as Kimberly. It's James Vanderbeek as Rocky, who's interrogating her, and that's sort of the framing device. He's defected to the Machine Empire, and he's interrogating her, trying to discern the location of Tommy Oliver. And in the course of that interrogation, you get to see sort of what became of Zach, of Billy, of Trini, and eventually Tommy enters the picture, and then we get our little twist there about Kimberly's true nature. So it was cool to watch, but I bring it up in the context of this because, like I said, I think you see these three instances to tell these stories, more adult stories that are geared for people who grew up with it. I think the comics, and I really was a big fan of Once and Always. I think the comics and Once and Always strike the best balance in terms of still honoring the spirit of the show and are in keeping with that original series that we grew up with, but just kind of taking it, not all the way. all the way to the next level, but just kind of elevating a bit and giving us a little more to chew on. And so that's definitely what I felt reading these comics, no doubt.
Yeah. The highest compliment that I can give these books, and Once and Always to a certain extent too, is that while I was reading them, I felt the same sense of nostalgia I did while watching Power Rangers as a kid. Like it gave me that same feeling as an adult, because I can't get that feeling anymore from going back and watching those episodes. I've aged out of it, so to speak. So I can watch them from just a pure nostalgia perspective. But like reading those books, I got that same feeling of like sitting in front of the TV on a Saturday morning.
I hear you. The highest praise I can give, and I've talked about this here and I've talked about it on Digging for Kryptonite, I've always had this weird aversion to like comic book adaptations of other properties for whatever. Like I can't tell you why, but and I talked about this too, when we talked about the beginning of the Boom era. So, I didn't go into this sort of predisposed to buying in, right? And the fact that I was reading these and I just felt like I was just in that Power Rangers world. You know, again, I think is one of the best things that I can say about it. Like I was just all in on this and I was invested. And it's just like it felt of that world. You know, I didn't feel like I was reading, okay, this is a comic book adaptation. No, I felt like I was reading a chapter in the Power Rangers lore. And that was cool and that was special. And it was something new.
Yeah, I mean, like to your point, licensed comics are usually not very good, and so I also have an aversion to them and rarely check in on them. You know, unless it's something I'm really, really, really into. This is the only one I can think of in modern memory. You know, of the last 20 years of comic publishing that I've really genuinely enjoyed. For all of the reasons that you stated. Like it does everything it needs to do, and I think a lot of that is Kyle Higgins. Like he's he's someone who is of our age. I remember reading a letters column with him. I don't know if you've gotten around to it, but I do. I also am very lapsed on this, but I do recommend his book, Radiant Black, which is kind of his image book that is kind of his own spin on a Sentai series. Like it's his own property, and so he's got his own kind of take on it. And I remember reading the letters column in there and reading it and thinking about. He goes into like how he was the Power Rangers kid growing up. And I think he actually even called out that he was also the kid who watched Power Rangers like a little too long and got made fun of for it. And so like his love of that franchise comes across in the book. Certainly for the Mighty Morphin era, we could talk about it a little bit, how the rest of the franchise kind of is glorified cameos, but it worked for me because I'm only casually aware of them at best. So, but yeah, he clearly loves the franchise as much as you or I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that definitely comes through. So as far as Shattered Grid itself, there are any number of places we could start, but I mean, what resonated the most with you? What stood out the most to you, even before you did your reread? What were the aspects of the story that you didn't need a reminder of? Like, what were the things that really stood out?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The stuff that really, really stuck out to me was the alternate universe, like the universe that they call of the coinless is what they call them. Like that stuff is so cool to me. It checks all of my boxes. It's, as I said earlier, like Age of Apocalypse for X-Men or Back to the Future 2. It's that for Power Rangers. And seeing those designs, which I also think were Dan Mora, maybe, but the Red Ranger Sentry Guards and the Black Ranger, you know, Shock Troopers, that stuff. I remember reading that when I first got to those issues, and I was just blown away, like how cool that was for me. So that stuff really stuck out. And then there's a couple of moments just throughout the book that I remember very vividly. You know, a lot of the big end battle stuff with big double page spreads, but there's one page, I think it's at the end of issue 5, in which would be like 28 maybe or 27, when they send up the signal to bring in all the other Rangers, and they go out of the command center, and there's this incredible double page spread of them all just standing looking up at the sky as the other Rangers are flying in. And I just remember thinking, this is so beautiful. And again, I'll butcher the name, but Daniele di Nicuolo, we didn't talk about their art, but such a clean, elegant art style, like almost minimalist in a way, in terms of line work, but the colors. Again, I forget who did the colors on the book, but the colors are so vibrant and they pop so much, and it's just gorgeous. It's so gorgeous to look at, and that spread I remember really, really sticking with me. And then when I got to it again on the reread, I was so excited, and I just stared at it for a few minutes. I took a screen cap of it and made it the background on my iPad now, so that's where we're at.
I also took a screenshot of that. You know what it reminded me of? I forgive me, I forget. Did you watch Supernatural?
No, I did not. I mean, a little bit right at the beginning, but I that one missed me, unfortunately.
That's quite all right. It's I do recommend it, but it's also 15 seasons, so it's hard for me to be like, you really need to sit down and watch 300 plus episodes. But it is one of my favorite shows. But there is a moment throughout the run. I mean, it's quasi spoiler, but 300 episodes. There's still enough there where the angels fall to Earth, and it was so cool the way they brought that to life on screen. And they didn't have the biggest budget in the world, but they made it work and they saved their budget. It was a finale and they saved clearly they saved it for this, for this moment. And you saw the angels falling to earth. That's what I was thinking of when I was looking at that double page spread, and it's gorgeous. And you see, all of those beams of light as the different Rangers are teleporting in. It was so cool. I'll be honest. I felt like such an old man when I was this part of Shattered Grid, because I kept getting tripped up on exactly what the mechanics of this were, and I think I understand it.
You just gotta go with it, man. You know what actually tripped me up before you get into it is, again, because they didn't really establish all these rules, but there are so the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers are our focal characters, but then you've got Zeo and Turbo characters and stuff showing up. Those are the same people. So is it like they're from alternate timelines? You could probably cheat it by saying that. Anyway, I don't know what was tripping you up, but I remember I was thinking about that as I reread it.
So I think this is, and I know there are people who have really studied this who will be like, you guys, come on. But
someone is yelling at their phone right now. Someone is shouting into their podcast app.
It's all right. I feel like that's part of the fun of listening to a podcast. we all enjoy that. So if you're doing that right now, have at it. But my understanding, and I think this answers your question, because I was reading these pages over and over, and I felt like, what am I missing here? That I think the Morphin Grid itself protected itself by breaking and by sort of forming different dimensions, for lack of a better word, for each of the different eras of Power Rangers to create or to prevent the paradox, right? Because early on in this story, Tommy is killed by Lord Drakkon, right? So if we're following kind of time travel logic, everything else that would follow would sort of all fall apart, right? If he's now removed from the equation at an earlier point in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. But so the Morphin Grid protects itself by breaking and by, again, forming these little shards or pods or dimensions for all of the different eras. And throughout the story, the Rangers are traveling from one to the other. But that's how you're able to have all of these Rangers, all of these different Ranger teams seemingly existing simultaneously. They're like all shards of this grid. That was my reading of it. I could be wrong.
I will say that I did not think that hard about it, and I commend you for going that deep on logic. You know what? I'm gonna acquiesce and say that your explanation is the right one, because I don't have a better one. So I think that works for me.
But this is I wanted to ask you this, and this is kind of why I brought up Once and Always previously, because, and look, Once and Always just came out. These comics that we're talking about came out years earlier, but you watch Once and Always, and even some of the other reunion episodes, the legacy episodes that we've gotten over the years, like Dimensions in Danger and Forever Red and things like that. And you get the sense that all of these Ranger teams are existing or operating simultaneously anyway. But I guess to Kyle Higgins and company's credit, I feel like they went out of their way to sort of account for how you can have all of these teams interacting. Because again, you watch the special and it seems like they're just all out there anyway.
Yeah, I got it in my headcanon growing up that all of those teams were just well, this is San Diego's team of Power Rangers, and this is, Milwaukee's team of Power Rangers, so to speak. And then this kind of throws it all into chaos, but I guess all in service of getting to the end point of dimension ending threat or what have you.
Yes. So I don't know. I could have totally misinterpreted what the intention was here, but that was what it seemed to be saying. And I guess, again, does account for how the timeline didn't unravel by Tommy dying early in the story. Of course, he'll ultimately be all right by the time we get to the end of it. But that was one of the other things that I was struck by in reading this was, I guess going into it, I expected present day, quote unquote, regular Tommy Oliver would have such a larger role to play. And he doesn't, right? He's off the board for almost the entirety of it until we get to that special at the end after Lord Drakkon has rewritten reality. And then our Tommy makes his move.
It's kind of a bold choice when you really think about it, because you've got this villain, this anti version of one of your characters, and you, like you said, you take him off the board for the whole time, which I thought was an interesting choice. I mean, I would have been curious to see what this book looks like with him sort of at the forefront and like leading the charge, but also, as we were saying earlier, like giving Jason Scott a moment to shine here, I thought was really cool, because, that arousing, resting speech he gives to them about being Power Rangers and, holding the line and stuff was cool. And I like seeing him get a little bit more of a moment in the sun.
I agree. And maybe that's the trade-off. It's funny because as I was reading it, it felt like, and going back to what I was saying earlier, where it seems like there had been some talks about maybe doing some sort of live action adaptation of this. From a television production standpoint, it actually makes perfect sense if Tommy Oliver is killed, right? Because now you don't have to have Jason David Frank playing two versions for this entire story. But again, we're in the comic book realm, so you can go nuts and you don't have to worry about that. But I guess the other reason, to your point, is that it does allow this space for Jason. And I don't want to sound like a broken record with this, but going back to our very first episode, and I've referenced this a number of times, but we covered Green with Evil. And as much as I know it's the Tommy arc, it's still, rewatching, I'm like, it's really a Jason story. Tommy's under the spell for the whole thing. You really get to see Jason try to keep this team together, try to deal with this new threat. He's powerless fighting Goldar in that hidden dimension. It's, to me, I looked at it more, I was going in, of course, Tommy on the brain, and I'm watching it, and I really feel like it's really more Jason's story. And again, similarly here, as much as Lord Drakkon looms over everything, if not that we necessarily have a POV character, but if it's anyone, I feel like it's Jason.
Yeah, and you talked about this a little bit when you covered the 2017 reboot too. That's very much a Jason movie. I guess also by virtue of Tommy not being in that movie at all, but like seeing that character, that reluctant leader archetype, just trying to hold everything together, works for this story in particular, because it ups the stakes. It makes it feel more dire, and having Jason at the forefront kind of punctuates that.
Yeah. What did you think about, and I believe these are additions to the lore that we got here. I'm not aware of them appearing elsewhere. Correct me if I'm wrong, or audience, correct me if I'm wrong, but the emissaries that Zordon goes to, and the idea of the Morphin Masters who created the Morphin Grid. I found that very intriguing. Has that been established elsewhere?
I could be wrong, but I think the Morphin Masters have been mentioned or referenced in the past. Don't quote me on that. Again, people are shouting into their podcast device. The emissaries, I don't know for sure, but I thought it was really intriguing, like you said, and like some real deep canon stuff for these books, like additive to that, to the canon, and cool. And I don't know how far you've gotten into the Boom books. I ended up falling off a little bit of a ways off from where Shattered Grid ends, but they come back into it in a pretty big way too, which was pretty neat to see.
Yeah, Shattered Grid now is as far as I've read, and I think this will probably be it for us for comic book coverage on the podcast, but I might continue to read on my own. I don't know. I know after this we have Beyond the Grid, we have Necessary Evil, we have the Unlimited Power era, we have the Recharged era. So I know there's a lot more to come, but this takes us to the end of the Kyle Higgins era, except for Soul of the Dragon, which we are going to get to in an upcoming episode. But
what I will say for you, because I read all through the main book, and then it ended and rebooted as two books, which is a classic comic book move. Why when we're selling 100,000 units of one book, why don't we just launch another book and sell 200,000? Unbeknownst to you, you will likely sell 50,000 of each of those books, but that's neither here nor there. And I kept up with that for a little bit, and then I fell off, unfortunately. Not for no real reason. It wasn't that I wasn't enjoying it, but the one thing that I will say for you that you will very much enjoy is they give an in-canon reason why Zach, Trini, and Jason left for the World Peace Summit or whatever it was, which I thought was a really nice little touch.
Although I haven't read it, I am aware of the Omega Rangers business, and that's a cool touch. Like, that's one of those things where again, it feels like it's made for us, right? Because and we've talked about that whole business of how that went down on the show, and sort of getting this other layer of, oh yeah, but hey, they were actually the secret operative team that was out there. Very cool. So for that alone, I might continue. I really am enjoying these, so I think I'll continue. I'll continue on, even if we're not necessarily doing episodes on it. But yeah, you have these emissaries of the Morphin Grid, right? And Zordon makes this plea to them, right, to try to intervene. Lord Drakkon is running amok. He's stealing these morphers. The Morphin Grid itself is in danger, and there's this cost to Zordon that's alluded to, and then you get the explanation for it that by making this plea to them, by entering their domain and making this request to get the Morphin Masters to intervene, he has now relinquished his ability to join them in the Morphin Grid when he eventually leaves this plane of existence. So there's that whole business going on too.
Again, like just a really great narrative device for helping to up the stakes. Like by the time you get to the end of the book, like look, I can't speak for you. I know you've read quite a few comic books, and so have I, but like I'm kind of exhausted by these things at a certain point because they all feel so samey. And so I really do have to commend the team on these books for really making it feel dire and simultaneously walking the tightrope of stakes and plot while balancing the character drama too. And I could have used a little bit more of that character drama. Like Drakkon doesn't really get a ton of motivation, which I would have liked to see. Maybe you're a little bit fresher on the stuff before Shattered Grid starts, but I found the notion very intriguing that of all the universes that exist out there, his was the only one where Tommy stayed bad. That was like a cool thing that you could have played with. And yeah, they touch on it like a little bit in that Shattered Grid one shot when he's living his kind of idyllic life, which is very, very comic booky. Like the most comic booky trope you can have is like the alternate dimension, what if, could have been, happy life. I think they do that every time any character dies, like Captain America did it, Swamp Thing did it, like that kind of stuff. But I would have liked to see a little bit more villain motivation out of him because that's kind of interesting.
I'm very glad you brought that up. I was going to ask you that because I didn't know if I was being unnecessarily harsh or missing something or whatnot, but I echo that completely. As I was reading this, I kept waiting for that moment where something kind of clicked into place, where it's like, oh, and that's why he's the way he is, or that's why he's doing this. Something more that we hadn't seen, right? It was just that he had made this choice to continue to align with Rita after all of that Green with Evil business. And yeah, I guess I kept waiting for some sort of payoff or twist or something that would have elevated it a little bit or given greater understanding to what his whole deal was. And we never got that. I think when we get to that final issue, I know we're jumping around, but I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you're familiar with the story. When we get to that final issue, the concluding chapter of all of this, where Drakkon has entered the Morphin Grid, and has reshaped reality, and he's this hero, but there are kind of cracks, and there are these energy beasts that he's fighting, and that's a manifestation of his doubts, coming into play. And then the real Tommy Oliver re-enters the picture, and they have their final face-off, and it's this overall message of like, hey, our Tommy Oliver, like I have friends, like people help me, people rely on me, and vice versa. And that's the difference between us, right? You never let other people in. That tracks and that works. But again, I think that speaks more to our Tommy. I felt like I never felt like we got that. I felt like there was a little something missing there on the Drakkon side. Maybe you don't need that. Maybe it's enough that he just, made this choice and that's it. But there's a little more I wanted there.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of different ways you could have given him a little bit more villain juice motivationally. Like, I don't know, make it so that he went to go join the Power Rangers in his universe and they didn't want him on the team because they thought he was still evil or something. And then you've got a little bit more motivation there, and it ties back into that finale about how, look, we just fixed it. Like, and then it ties back into Tommy and the whole "my friends are my real strength" classic Power Rangers message.
Yes. Yeah, I think there was a little bit more that could have been done there, but We've been talking about this idea too, and I think it's true that as much as there are so many other Rangers from different eras in the mix, I guess this cuts both ways a little bit. For me, it's not that I felt lost, but I wasn't necessarily, the cameos didn't do much for me because I don't have that connection. But at the same time, there are people, again, who, to your point, have watched all the way through. There are people who started long after you and I stopped watching, right? So to have this story that could speak to anyone kind of in those groups, I appreciate that. So I don't begrudge Shattered Grid for including the other characters, and it wouldn't be Shattered Grid if it didn't, right? In my mind, it's like I just want to see Mighty Morphin and Zeo, but it's like that's not shattered enough. So I get that, but my mileage, I didn't get as much out of that. However, I do appreciate that it didn't ultimately overpower the core cast that we've been with all along. And I don't know, there might be people who are huge fans of Power Rangers Samurai, for example, who are like, hey, why didn't they get more play? Or although they did get a fair amount, but whatever your favorite team is, you might have felt a little bit left out. But I think in terms of what this book was, right, and the team that it was focusing on, I think it did a good job of bringing in enough of those other fan service elements while still keeping their eye on the ball with our main cast, right?
Yeah, agreed. Like this couldn't be everything to everybody from a Power Rangers fan perspective, but they did drive they did walk a very fine line there. And like you said, there's definitely some people who felt a little slighted by such and such didn't get a story arc here, but it really did work for me. Going back to what we were saying at the beginning about someone who's sort of casually aware of Power Rangers Samurai or Power Rangers RPM and Time Force, which seem to be like the three biggest ones that got some shine. Like seeing them did just enough for me to be like, oh, this is cool, this is neat, this is additive, without A, feeling overpowering, or B, taking away from our core cast members.
By any chance, did you, not necessarily for this, but because it wasn't, I think I had sent you the deluxe edition hardcover contents, and this wasn't even in there, but there was the 2018 annual that also tied into Shattered Grid. Do you remember reading that by any chance?
I did read it probably at the time, but I didn't reread it for this. That was like a lot of short stories of different teams and stuff, right?
Yes. And I'll be honest, of that annual, the only one I read, not surprisingly, was the Zeo one. It was the lead off story, and Kyle Higgins wrote that one. And you don't find out until the end, but it's Lord Drakkon posing as Tommy in the Zeo team and having this conversation with Jason. It's as Jason is leaving and they're giving him like this goodbye party. And they have this conversation on the roof of the command center where, quote unquote, Tommy, but really Lord Drakkon is saying like, hey, did you ever, doubt me after I broke free of Rita's spell and this and that? And, Jason, of course, is very supportive in typical Jason fashion. And the reason why I read it was there was an editor's note about it in one of the issues, one of the core issues, because I think it's Finster 5 who's questioning Lord Drakkon about the amount of time he spent with the Zeo Rangers as he's holding the Zeonizer.
Okay.
There's a reference to that, and I was like, oh, okay, what was the backstory there? So I went back and I read it. It was cool. And again, as a big Zeo fan, I was like, all right, I wanted to at least see what that was about. But yeah, I mean, I think all in all, they struck a good balance, and the idea of it is really cool, right? I feel like you look at something like Once and Always, or maybe some of these other reunion episodes, we've seen teams interacting and things like that, but this was a few years ago, and this really, I think, took things to a huge level. You wonder what something like this would look like realized on screen, as cool as it is on the page, because you don't have the voices, right? You don't have the music. There, certain aspects of it that would be cool to see brought to life, but still, I think worked really effectively here.
I will say I did listen to the 2017 Power Rangers score while I was reading some of this. I know you had talked about that on your episode about that movie. That score is tremendous. It's so good. That movie, and again, I don't want to segue too much and talk about the movie, but I could. That movie does so many things right, and it punches above its weight class in so many ways. And the music, I remember, thinking this is a tremendous score that has so much emotionality, and it actually, I encourage you to maybe go back and like reread the last two issues while listening to that. It worked for me.
Nice. No, I am a big fan of that score. So no, I might just do that. I've done that with other things too. It really can, can enhance the reading experience when you have that, for sure. Ninjor. I was very pleasantly surprised to see Ninjor pop up. We have, Drakkon takes the Ninjor of our world, right, back to his world and brainwashes him, and ultimately he has to be rescued. But that's what allows Lord Drakkon to be able to sort of, tap into these other morphers and use them the way that he does. But it was cool, especially having rewatched Ninja Quest fairly recently, and this whole business about Ninjor being the one who originally forged the coins, and of course on the show he gives them the ninja powers and all that. He's this key figure here. So again, as far as fan service that really connects back to the show, it was appropriate, and that was a key piece that I thought was cool to include.
I always liked him too. There was not a ton of him from what I remember. Again, you're fresher on this than I am. He was kind of the surrogate replacement for them getting the powers in the show versus the movie, right? So he wasn't really around until like that last season, if memory serves.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, I always enjoyed him. He was cool. He became a big ass sword. That was always neat.
But what's funny with the show is that, yes, he gives them the powers, and in my mind, I don't know that I even remembered him sticking around, but in rewatching it, it's not like he's there a lot, but they do call upon him in battle. He becomes kind of part of that Zord escalation, right? Where they either before or after they summon their Zords, it's like, we need help from Ninjor, and he flies in. And so he was there, kind of a fair amount. So it was, I think, appropriate to see him represented here.
I always wondered why. There's two things that always bothered me about Power Rangers. One was, it always took a very long time to morph or form the Megazord. So what the hell were the bad guys doing while this was happening? I know that's a common joke, but like they're all just standing there waiting for them to, yell out the name of their Zord and stuff. And the other thing was, and this is such an anime trope too, is there's always that escalation you mentioned. There's always another weapon to unlock or a new Zord or a new, why don't the guys in charge just give them that from the beginning? Like if you're sending teenagers out into the battlefield, these people have just hit puberty. You're not going to equip them with the all of the tech you've got. You're sitting on Zords in the garage that you're waiting for a rainy day. So that always just struck me as a little obnoxious. But I did always like seeing some new toyetic shit pop out of the ground.
No, I know. I'm with you. And we going back to Zordon's rules for them, right? Not revealing their identity. Okay, we get that. Not using your powers for personal gain. I'm on board with that. The one I've always bumped up against is you never escalate a battle. It's like, why not? Why not? Like, why don't you just call in the Zords immediately before the monster grows and just stomp them? Again, clearly we have to have an episode, and I get it. And maybe there's some sort of idea of fair play or whatnot, but it just, in terms of strategy, it makes no sense.
Especially when you think about that these are teenagers who are like hiding their secret identity, and like efficiency of time would be really helpful here so they could get back to class or the juice bar or whatever.
Absolutely. There's, just going back to Go-Go Power Rangers for a second, and it's in that Shattered Grid tie-in arc, but there's all of this business with Jason's father who's ill, and he's been keeping it from his family. And there's a scene where Jason goes to Zordon, and he's pleading with Zordon to intervene.
Tremendous scene.
Right?
I was genuinely moved by it. I like reading it this week.
Yeah, it was like, that's the kind of stuff that the comics have been doing that I really appreciate, because the show was never, it wasn't built for this, right? Dealing with tension between the Rangers and Zordon or anything like that. And the comics, I feel, have brought up some very valid points and questions, and getting moments like that. Or even earlier on with Go-Go, where Zach goes to Zordon. It's like, hey, like, why wasn't I the leader? And Zordon has this whole lesson. We need multiple leaders within the team. And there are instances where Jason's not there. And Zach, we do see Zach step up. And similarly here, this conversation where, Jason's pleading with him to help his father. And Zordon has this whole lesson about allowing events to unfold naturally and everything like that. And I appreciate that. And I'll also say the moments with Jason and his father where Jason's dad is like, you don't burden your family, your loved ones with your problems. And then of course that comes back around later when Jason forces the issue, right, and makes his father reveal his health condition to the mother. But that, especially now as a father, I always kind of have my antenna up for stuff like that, and I think that's an important lesson, and I think that's something maybe more of a generational thing, right, where this idea of the parents and especially the father, right, like you don't show that you're struggling with something per se, but I think more my personal view is I think it's important, right, to share kind of what you're feeling, what you're going through, because everybody goes through these things. Anyway, just to kind of have these ideas floating around, I thought was cool.
Well, also, Kimberly dealing with, again, in that arc, dealing with her father and mother splitting up is something, again, the show was not built for, but is something that teenagers face every day, and was just really cool to see how that sort of affected just that the character arc that we were talking about, and fed back into the plot narrative, which again was a such a Power Rangers thing. If they did an episode of the show about that, I'm sure Rita would have created like a divorce monster to fight them at at the law offices where her parents were signing the papers or something.
Yes, very much so. Well, speaking of Rita, when we also have this bit where Zordon has to align with Rita, they actually have to team up to try to take down Lord Drakkon. Another, again, very unlikely pair, but I thought that was a neat twist as well.
It was cool to see my man Doggy Kruger there. That was another Power Rangers season that I was like casually aware of, and I remember thinking, like, you mean to tell me that there's a Power Ranger that is like a 6 foot tall anthropomorphic cop dog? And I was like, this is the coolest shit I've ever seen. I have, it's not here, but I bought that action figure, even though I've never really watched that season. I just thought he looked so cool. So I've got him on my desk at work.
Nice. So that was an instance where I was completely lost. And I was like, I don't know this character, but I went with it. It was all good.
Yeah. He's like the Zordon of the team for the ones that are like cop adjacent.
Gotcha. Okay. Going back to what you were saying before about just kind of the appeal of the coinless world, Lord Drakkon's reality, I agree with you. It's just getting to see, for example, in the Go-Go Power Rangers arc, where we get the backstory of the Ranger Slayer, right? Kimberly Hart, who eventually will be brainwashed by Lord Drakkon, but we get to see her earlier on in her journey, and she and Bulk are this amazing team, and they're protecting the human survivors and everything. And, that was great. And then we also get Skull as one of the sentries, right?
Undercover was really cool. Yeah.
But undercover, and he ends up helping our crew get Ninja out, and he pays the ultimate price for it. But even that, like, Bulk and Skull get some cool moments in this.
Do you ever watch Battlestar Galactica?
No.
There's a really cool arc of Battlestar Galactica where the whole show is them on the run from the Cylons, and they settle down and they live on a planet for a little while, and then the Cylons show up and they enslave them all, and there's like a multi-episode arc to kick off a season where they're all like a resistance force fighting against their oppressors, and it reminded me a lot of that, and those were like some of the best episodes of Battlestar Galactica. But it also had a little Terminator, that kind of post-apocalyptic stuff going on, and it was just really neat to see. And again, the designs of those sentries and Drakkon and Finster 5 and just remixing that mythology was awesome, and really just checked a lot of boxes for me.
Right on. There was a point in time where I owned the Battlestar Galactica complete series Blu-ray, and I never watched it, and I ended up selling it. It's one of those ones I will probably get to at some point. The Sopranos also fell in that category, where I owned the complete series DVD, sold it, but then eventually watched it on streaming. Good. And yeah, that was early.
This was about to become a Sopranos podcast, so you're very you lucked out.
Just a quick tangent, but yeah, that was early on in the pandemic. That was our main pandemic binge very early on, and yeah, one of those shows where you go in and it's like, wow, how good could it possibly be? And then you watch, you're like, oh, it really is that good.
Yeah. Everyone really knew what they were talking about with this one. Yeah, absolutely. But, back to that coinless world stuff, I would have loved to see more of that. And I remember, again, you're fresher, but they spend a little bit more time on that world a bit earlier in the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Like, I remember, I think Zach or Billy and Tommy get stranded there for a little bit, and that's how they learn of it.
Yep.
Yeah. I remember there's a scene where Saba is telling them about everything that sort of happened in the history of this world, and like how Drakkon got formed, and the day that all the Rangers died or whatever. I remember reading that and being like, oh shit, like this is real here. We got some stakes. And there's that cool moment where they mentioned that Zordon created the White Ranger to combat him, but since Tommy wasn't around, they were going to give Jason the White Ranger powers, and they kind of show him like taking it before Drakkon gets it. And I was like, oh, I would have really loved to see a little combo White-Red Ranger. Would have been really neat to see.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny. It's been quite a while now since we read those issues and talked about them, but I do remember that. And that was definitely a standout. We've mentioned this Go-Go tie-in arc, but essentially I think the most relevant piece to Shattered Grid is this idea that the Ranger Slayer from Drakkon's world, an older Kimberly Hart who had been brainwashed and sent to rescue Drakkon and arrives too early, and is ultimately saved by the Rangers and breaks free from Drakkon's control. At the end of the story, she finds the Tommy Oliver of that time period, right before he'd become evil, before he joined the team and everything, and shoots him with this arrow that includes part of that green chaos crystal or whatever that was.
The MacGuffin arrow. She hits him with the MacGuffin arrow.
Yes, exactly. And tells him like she'll know what to do when the time comes, or something. He'll know what to do when the time comes, something to that effect. And then in the main Shattered Grid story, where Tommy is seemingly killed by Lord Drakkon, there's this moment where he's like, "Oh, that's what she meant." And then you get the payoff of that in the final issue, where after Drakkon has rewritten reality, that arrow, that energy is what allowed Tommy to survive, right? And now be able to re-enter the picture and do battle with Drakkon. I thought that was I felt like a great tie-in that really allowed both books to continue to do their own thing, but to really work hand in hand. And if you had only read one or the other, you still get, I think, a satisfying story, but you read them together and it all clicks. And I feel like that's the best of both worlds when you have this kind of event.
Very elegantly done. Especially when you think about the fact that those books are publishing simultaneously, happening in two very different time periods in the story. Finding a way for those to naturally tie in is not an easy thing to do. And I thought they did a great job.
Yes. For sure.
Can we talk about the ending? Because I have thoughts.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to go to next. Yeah, go for it.
I don't like it. I was very disappointed. And here's why. Like, the book did such a great job of establishing all these stakes, and you've got personal stakes, you've got world-ending stakes. You brought in all these other teams. You had a cool united front. There's a lot of cool fan servicey moments, right? Like them making a Megazord out of a bunch of different Zords. That's neat and something you hadn't seen before. But it kind of just ends. Like there's a personal resolution there when you get into this alternate universe where Drakkon's this hero, living this idyllic life, but you got to have a final fight. You don't actually get a final fight out of the whole thing. Like that Shattered Grid one shot needed like 10 extra pages where you snap back out of this alternate reality. Everyone's back on the moon and Tommy's in the fight now. And you get a final fight there with all of them just wailing on the guy.
I don't disagree. I can't disagree. It's true. We built to this climax before that special where the Ranger teams, the remaining surviving Ranger teams, are united, and they have a twofold objective on the moon, on Drakkon's world, right? Of destroying this transmitter that is allowing Drakkon to power his various armies, right? Using these stolen morphers. But then you also have all of these Rangers he's taken, and he's got them locked up on the moon base, right? So there are these tangible objectives. But then Drakkon achieves his aim of acquiring enough power to enter the Morphin Grid. And then this is when we get this other reality where he's Earth's protector, but then the cracks start to show. And then our Rangers come back. And I agree. It felt like a little too easy after. That's the thing. And you put it perfectly. The book went out of its way and did a great job of showing how dire things were, that it kind of felt like, oh, okay. You felt like you needed more to then undo that, get around that. And Yeah, I think there
I've
might
got
have
it.
been a little missing piece there.
I've got it. We can fix this again. We're going to fix it right now. Here's what you do. So you finish the book up. You do the same thing with the idyllic Drakkon world. You pop out of that. Tommy's back. You're on the moon. All the Rangers are there. Now you've also freed all the Rangers that are in captivity, right? So Drakkon doesn't have an army because they've all been depowered, but he's still super duper strong. What do? You have all these Rangers that were freed give their power to Tommy, soup them up. You get your one-on-one fight. Everybody wins here. Everyone's satisfied.
Yeah, that would have been cool. Yeah, that would have been cool. At the same time, in fairness, I'll play devil's advocate. If we are only going to get one showdown, I did appreciate the more personal face-off that we get between the two of them. I think, yeah, in an ideal scenario, based on what was set up, you probably could have done with both. But
a little bit more bombast, but yeah, you're right. The personal touch there works too, just not as well as I would have liked.
Yeah, exactly. But especially since, like we said, in contrast to Go-Go Power Rangers, or even what came before in Mighty Morphin, Shattered Grid was this huge, and by design, right? It's this huge event, and there's a lot going on. You have all these Ranger teams floating around and all that stuff, and it's fun and everything. But we are losing the core, a little bit of that core, that emotional connection, the personal touch. And I think that final confrontation between Tommy brings a lot of that back. But yeah, in an ideal scenario, maybe we could have had both. The thing that struck me, and having not read past this, I don't know, but so at the end of this, the Rangers have to sort of reshape reality, right? And there's this question of, do we forge a new reality or do we put things back as they were? And they land seemingly on putting it back as it was. But even then, there's this idea that, again, once a piece of glass has been shattered, it can never be fit back together perfectly. So things aren't going to be necessarily the same. So is the idea moving forward that what we're getting isn't necessarily beholden to the established lore from the TV series? Is that the gist of it?
I guess. I mean, I kind of feel like the book was already doing that in so many ways. It was adhering to the superstructure of Power Rangers, but it was really kind of doing its own thing. If that is sort of the rallying cry of, well, now we're going to go off and really do our own thing, I don't know if they actually ended up delivering on that, because to the best of my knowledge, the book kind of continued to like toe that line of, this is the Power Rangers that you remember growing up, but it is also kind of its own thing. Nothing really super radical changed after that, from my recollection of reading the next 20 or so odd issues.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's one of the benefits of that Mighty Morphin show, is that, with the exception of the Rangers changing or new powers or new Zords, and those happen at very specific points, as long as you're kind of bobbing and weaving among them, you're good, right? Because there are so many of those Monster of the Week episodes. It's really just as long as you're keeping track of those sort of bigger picture tent poles in the series. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I'll kind of keep that in mind if and when I continue with Beyond the Grid and Necessary Evil and all that stuff. But all in all, like I keep saying, I enjoyed this. I'm glad I finally read it. I know this was a huge moment for the franchise generally, and especially for the comics and for the Kyle Higgins run and all that. I keep going back to that to belabor the point, but those Go-Go issues really, in this reading project in preparation for this episode, those are the ones that I really gravitated towards even more and really resonated with me. So I enjoyed all of it, but those in particular.
Ryan Parrott is writing the main book now, and I believe has for a little bit. Again, I've fallen off, but that's good incentive as any to jump back in, because he really is great and has a really good handle on those five as characters.
Is there anything that, again, you had read it before and then you read it again for this, was there anything that jumped out to you or resonated with you differently, or anything like that the second time around?
Yeah, little things like since I read it the first time to the second time, I actually did watch Power Rangers RPM, and there's a lot of RPM stuff in this. That season is actually pretty cool. So I was saying earlier in the show, like I read an article of the 10 best Power Rangers seasons or whatever, and that's like always comes near the top on those lists. It's a real fan favorite. Everyone always kind of holds it up as, oh, well, this is the dark season, this is the adult season, and it's not. It's still very much a Power Ranger season. It is very much aimed at kids of a toy buying age, but there is some really interesting stuff there. So it's kind of like Mad Max meets Terminator in a lot of ways. So there's this AI, there's Skynet basically. Instead of Rita, they have their own version of Skynet in this season. It's like it's an AI that has wiped out the planet, and it's an arid wasteland, and there's like one city standing left that has a dome over it, and the Power Rangers protect this dome from the robots and the AI and stuff. And then there's a character that, you know, doesn't have his memories and is somehow connected to the robot, and that's very much a Terminator-esque plot. But the thing that was really cool is there's this scientist, and she's in the book, Dr. K, and she helps the Rangers out a lot. She's got this really kind of weirdly tragic backstory for a kids show where she was abducted as a kid by the government and put into like a scientific research program because she was genetically predisposed or had a, you know, was incredibly smart, and they basically just like locked her in a jail cell and made her do science, and she creates the Rangers in this season. So it was cool to see that stuff. It was, you know, it was additive to me having had watched that season somewhat recently. Again, I imagine that if you are a hardcore fan, you're like, that's cool. I would have also really liked to see this season and that season get that much time. But that was neat and added a little bit more color to the book.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. No, that's the thing. I don't know, other than the beginning of Turbo, which we will get into not too long from now, because of course that's still part of Tommy's story. And we'll dabble in a little Dino Thunder because, again, Tommy's story. I don't know that I really have it in me to watch the later seasons, because when you take away that nostalgia and that personal attachment, even something like Turbo and Dino Thunder, at least there's the Tommy connection. But I have zero. There's no childhood memory of watching any of that stuff. I don't know that it would really work for me. And I've had such a good time so far. It's like I don't want to. I don't know. I just don't know that's the path for me to sort of watch the seasons, you know, after I stopped.
Yeah, I definitely couldn't do that. I think that was enough for me for another like 10 years. I am weirdly invested in the mythology of Power Rangers. I think that just comes from the nostalgia, but I have rarely enjoyed watching the show, old or new episodes, in later in life, which is why the comics actually work for me really well. They feel like they're a little bit more tailor-made to how I can properly consume that mythology.
No, I understand. Look, starting this podcast, I didn't know what the experience would be like going back and watching them. And thankfully,
has it been rough for you? Is it like, you know, is it aged? Is it still enjoyable for you?
No, that's the thing. I am genuinely enjoying them. And I've said this a bunch of times. In fairness, I am skipping over the typical run-of-the-mill Monster of the Week episodes, and I'm watching the bigger episodes and arcs. So I'm cheating a little bit, but even within that, it's still, I've genuinely been enjoying them. It's not just watching it from an academic perspective, and it's like, okay, we'll talk about them. I am enjoying them, and yes, there's all of the childhood memories wrapped up in it. And if you took those away, would I react the same? No, of course not. But even with that, I'm still getting into them, and there is some, even with an adult critical lens, there are things here and there where I'm like, oh, that was really good. Like that was a clever bit, or that was an unexpected choice, and it might just be that I've watched so much of it now that it's like I'm all turned around and I don't know, but they've genuinely been fun. I'm happy to report that. Otherwise, this would be, you know, a chore, right? And I wouldn't want that. So thankfully, that's not been the case.
That's great. I mean, on the 30th anniversary of the show, of all things, that's great. Now, maybe I'll go back and give it another shot. Like Once and Always was nice. It was a nice little trip down memory lane, but you know, I'm always looking for stuff to put on in the background while you're cleaning the house or whatever. Maybe it's time to take a trip down to Mighty Morphin or Zeo and see what's going on.
There's, you know, not to just plug our past episodes, but in Zeo in particular, there's the 2-part. Well, it's really a 3-parter. because it starts off with Where in the World is Zeo Ranger 5, and then there's the two-part King for a Day where Tommy is brainwashed and he thinks he's the leader of the Machine Empire, and Jason as the Gold Ranger has to step up and lead the team, and they have this face-off in this like gladiator arena on an alien planet. Very good stuff, like genuinely good. As I was watching, like this was really strong, and it tied together so much. I felt of especially where the show had started with Green with Evil. Now you had the echoes of that on a number of levels. Really, like that was really good.
There's a lot of that stuff I remember in space, in Power Rangers Space, tying together a lot of that mythology and bringing it back to the beginning with the characters, most of whom had cycled out of the show. But there's a lot of Zordon stuff and a lot of Power Rangers overall mythology of the characters that I distinctly remember Space going a little bit harder on, that you might find some more enjoyment now out of having done this podcast.
I feel like that's the if I were going to watch another season after what I saw, I think that would probably be the one. So there was a Shattered Grid game, right? An online game.
I don't know about an online game. There's a fighting game called Battle for the Grid, gotcha, which is just it. It's like a Street Fighter, but with different characters from all different seasons, and there's a lot of Shattered Grid stuff in there. I think if you play, you could play that 1 versus 1 and be whoever. But I think the main campaign story is based on Shattered Grid, and you could play as Drakkon or you could play as the Ranger Slayer and that kind of stuff. It's a lot of fun, actually. I played that a little bit. It scratched the itch too of getting more mythology and seeing more Rangers and things that I might not necessarily have watched the seasons of, but I'm like, oh, this guy looks cool. He's got cool powers. I'm decent with him in a fighting game, that kind of stuff.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, not much of a gamer these days, but I like the idea of that, and that's neat. And is there anything else about Shattered Grid, the comic, that we didn't talk about that you wanted
to? The only thing I think we didn't talk about that I thought was interesting and neat was giving. I feel bad. We've been talking a lot about Jason on this episode, but in so many ways, he is very much a central figure for the book. But giving him a weird kind of romantic love interest in Lauren from the Samurai Rangers, which was cool and interesting, and I thought actually worked for me on the page. I was kind of more invested in that than a lot of the other sort of side narratives that were going on. I would like to see a little bit more of that.
I agree with that. And we mentioned before at the beginning of the Go-Go series, this crush that Trini has on Jason. Even if you don't remember that specifically, just the idea of that, interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Again, the show never had the time or the interest in kind of dealing with these inter-team dynamics unless it was really relevant to the plot, right? Someone's brainwashed or someone's trying to learn a lesson and we have to rally behind them. But there was never, outside of Tommy and Kimberly, there was not a whole lot going on for the personal lives of the other 4. So that was interesting to see. And again, you could correct me. You might have seen a little bit more of that recently where you're like, oh no, actually they did give, such and such a love interest and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, not particularly. There's one other thing I was going to say. Now it has escaped me. Oh, well, maybe it'll come back to me as we're wrapping up here, but, I'm trying to think I feel like there was something else that was on the tip of my tongue and now I don't have it, but that's okay. But yeah, I mean, there's, that relationship piece. And I know we talked about, Matthew Cook and all of that as well. And, I think all in all, and especially I appreciated the entire reading experience because I think I got a nice balance between sort of that bigger event, right. And then the smaller, more personal stories. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. I'm glad we can check off Shattered Grid, from the list after all this time.
I'm very glad you enjoyed it. The book doesn't quite fall off a cliff after that, but I think you've probably reached the peak for at least my personal enjoyment of the book. And again, I haven't checked in on it in 3 or 4 years, 2 years maybe at this point. So maybe I should give it another go. But I remember it not being as gripping, so to speak.
Understood. I remembered what I was going to say. And I pretty sure I said this when we talked about the beginning of the Boom era, but I'll bring it up again here. I felt like the voices really all rang true for virtually all of the characters. The one that I struggled with the most, I think, was Jason, but it's not the comic's fault. It's like the show, he talks more here. Like he has more to do. Yeah. He's dealing with more that he didn't on the show. And so in some of these, like, again, with Zach, with Kimberly, with Billy, with all of them, I'm able to hear the actors in my head and imagine the characters on screen saying that. I felt like where I had the hardest time doing that was with Jason. How did you feel?
I agree. You hit the nail on the head, because for the other 4 or 5, if you include Tommy, definitely hear their voices as I'm reading it. Jason, not so much, but to your point, that's a function of the fact that he doesn't really have much in the way of that character development from the show. He's just kind of broad, with a couple of notable exceptions in specific episodes. He's just kind of leader dude. So giving him that Cyclops, that Leonardo archetype works for me, because those tend to be my sort of favorite characters.
Yes. Well, listen, man, it was so great to catch up. I mean, the audience doesn't know. We haven't spoken in literally years. We were talking off mic. How long has it been? So, I mean, we've kept in touch, via text and social media and whatnot, but this was really fun. And I thank you for taking the time to reread and share your insight on all of this. And is there anything you want to direct folks towards, either following you on social media or the conventions you're involved with? Anything you want to plug?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. You can follow me on just about any social media that's out there at Delando Calrissian, spelled like you'd think it would be. I lucked out in my last name in that department. As far as other stuff I want to plug, New York Comic Con is my show. I am the event manager for it. I'm very proud of it, and our team. This year is going to be an insane year for New York Comic Con. I'm really, really excited about the guest lineup. We just revealed our sort of first slate of folks, and tickets are going on sale to the general public probably by the time you hear this. I think they're going on sale the 21st. So depending on when this comes out, they will likely be on sale already.
The 21st of June?
Yes,
they will already be on sale by the time people are hearing this. We're recording a little bit in advance. So very cool. All right. Well, I hope people will, if you're in the area or able to get to the area, I hope they will come. It's one not to be missed.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, man. Thank you, audience. As always, I always appreciate you tuning in, and of course, make sure you come back in 2 weeks for our next all new episode. Once a Ranger fan, always a Ranger fan. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.